He went hunting for food, but returned carrying a wounded Apache woman instead. Rancher Jack Carter woke early that morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the vast plains. The air was cool, the stillness of the wilderness untouched, and Jack knew today would be no different from any other hunting trip. His small ranch sat miles away from the nearest town, and the land was unforgiving. Food had to be hunted, water had to be collected. Life was a constant struggle, but Jack didn't mind the solitude. It suited him. He'd been alone for years, ever since his wife passed, leaving him to care for the ranch and the land. There were no children, no family nearby, just the endless land stretching in every direction. He preferred it that way. At least he didn't have to worry about anyone getting hurt in this dangerous part of the world. His rifle, worn from years of use, sat comfortably against his shoulder as he made his way through the dense brush. The trees were thick, casting long shadows over the land as Jack followed the trail of deer. His thoughts wandered to the coming winter, knowing that food would soon be harder to find. If he didn't get a good catch today, the next few months would be tough. After hours of tracking, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, followed by a rustle in the underbrush. Jack froze, listening intently. A horse was close, moving fast, and there was something off about the way it was running. No rider in control. His instincts kicked in. Jack crept through the trees, staying low. He had to make sure it wasn't a threat. A band of outlaws or a group of Apache warriors. He'd heard rumors of them in the area, and not all of them were friendly. But as he moved forward, the sight of the horse stopped him cold. A lone horse, a black mare, was running wild through the trees. Its rider was nowhere to be seen. Jack's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, ready to defend himself if needed. But before he could make a move, a soft groan, caught his attention. Looking closer, Jack saw a figure on the ground, hidden among the fallen leaves. It was a woman, her body lying half covered by the brush, her face pale and covered in dirt. Jack's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. She wasn't moving. The woman was hurt. Without hesitation, Jack rushed forward. He knelt beside her, quickly assessing her condition. She was unconscious, her clothes torn and stained with blood. Her long black hair framed a face that, even in the dirt and grime, had a wild beauty about it. But it was the wound that caught Jack's attention. A deep gash on her side, likely from a blade. Someone had attacked her. Jack's mind raced. He had heard stories about Apache raids in these parts, but he had never seen one up close. His ranch was too far out of the way for the raiders to bother with, usually. But here, on the edge of the forest, it seemed he had stumbled upon something unexpected. Jack wasn't a doctor, but he had learned enough about survival to know that this woman needed help. Fast. She wasn't going to survive out here alone, not with the blood she'd lost. He lifted her gently, cradling her body in his arms. Her skin was cold to the touch, her breath shallow. She was light, almost fragile, but there was a strength to her. Something in the way her features softened in her unconscious state told Jack that this wasn't just any woman. She wasn't a traveler lost in the woods. No, this woman had a purpose, a story he would never know unless he acted quickly. "Stay with me," Jack muttered to himself, though he didn't expect her to hear him. She needed care. She needed shelter. Jack wasn't sure what made him decide to take her back to the ranch. Maybe it was his sense of duty, or maybe it was the quiet desperation he felt deep inside, but something told him he couldn't just leave her there. If she was Apache, he would have to face the consequences later. But if he left her to die, he'd never forgive himself. The ride back was slow and cautious. Jack kept his hand on the rifle, scanning the woods for any sign of trouble. The mare, still loose, galloped beside him, as if it too sensed the danger. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, praying that no one would notice the wounded woman in his arms. As the ranch came into view, Jack's heart sank. He didn't have the luxury of a doctor. The nearest town was too far for help to reach in time. It was up to him. The only thing he could do was get her inside and try to stop the bleeding. He carried her into the house, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped through the door. The wooden floors creaked under his weight, and the smell of the fire in the stove filled the room. Jack laid her on the bed, his hands trembling as he checked her wound again. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. He knew he had to act fast. With steady hands, Jack tore a strip of cloth from one of his shirts, pressing it to the wound to staunch the bleeding. He worked quickly, doing what he could with the limited supplies he had. His heart raced as he tried to focus, not allowing himself to think about what might happen next. Minutes felt like hours as Jack worked, the silence of the ranch broken only by the sound of his hurried breaths and the crackling of the fire. It was strange, having someone else in his home, especially someone so vulnerable. He wasn't used to sharing his space, let alone taking care of someone, but he couldn't just leave her. She was here now, and he was responsible for her. As he finished tending to her wound, Jack stepped back and wiped the sweat from his brow. He had done all he could for now. All he could do was wait and hope that she would survive. Jack glanced down at her, his eyes lingering on her face. There was something about her, something fierce and untamed, even in her unconscious state. He didn't know who she was or why she had ended up in the woods, but something inside him knew that she was different. This wasn't just another stranger. She had a story, a past, and Jack couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her. He would have to keep his guard up. He didn't know what her people would do when they found her missing, but for now all he could do was wait and hope she didn't die before he could learn more about her. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind howling against the windows. Jack sat by the fire, watching over the Apache woman as the night stretched on. The sun had barely risen when Jack Carter woke to the sound of a soft groan from the bed. He had stayed awake through the night, keeping a close eye on the Apache woman, who now lay motionless under the rough quilt. His eyes hadn't left her face since he brought her inside. She was so still, her breathing shallow and uncertain, as if she were caught between the land of the living and something darker. Jack had seen his fair share of injury and death over the years, but this was different. This wasn't just another wound from a fight or a trap. This was something deeper, something more personal. The Apache woman had a strength about her, even in unconsciousness. Her features were wild and fierce, like the land itself. And as much as Jack tried to convince himself that she was just another stranger in need of help, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just a wounded soul in need of shelter. By midday, the woman's condition seemed stable. Her pulse had steadied and her breathing had grown deeper, but she still hadn't opened her eyes. Jack had spent hours checking her wound and making sure the bleeding had stopped. It wasn't a clean cut, and the blood had soaked through his shirt before he had managed to bind it up. He couldn't help but wonder who had done this to her, why she had been left for dead in the woods. The days grew longer as Jack worked on the ranch. Occasionally glancing at the woman lying on his bed, he found it hard to focus on his work, the silence of the house making him feel uncomfortable in a way he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the silence from the woman's absence of words. It was the silence from his own heart. Since his wife had passed, there had been no one to speak to, no one to share the quiet moments with. Now, the quiet was thick and heavy, pressing on his chest as if waiting for something to break it. Late that evening, as Jack sat by the stove, the crackling fire casting shadows against the walls, he heard a faint whisper. "Am I?" Jack stood up quickly, his boots clicking on the wooden floor as he rushed to the bed. There she was, the Apache woman, her eyes fluttering open slowly. She blinked a few times, as if adjusting to the dim light, before her gaze locked onto Jack. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her dark eyes studied him, filled with caution and confusion. Jack felt a rush of relief, but he didn't show it. He needed to remain calm, to not give away how much he had worried. He had no idea who she was or what had happened to her, but there was one thing he knew for sure. She wasn't just a wanderer. She had a story, one that would take more than just a few words to uncover. "Where am I?" she asked again, her voice weak but clear. Her lips were cracked, and her breath came in shallow gasps. "You're safe," Jack replied, keeping his tone steady. "You're at my ranch. You've been hurt." The woman blinked again, as if the information didn't quite make sense. She looked around, her eyes darting to the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, then back to Jack. "You helped me?" Her voice was hesitant, full of suspicion. "I did," Jack said, his voice quieter now. "You were hurt. I couldn't just leave you out there." Her gaze hardened slightly, but there was a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Jack could see the weight of the situation settle over her as she processed what he said. She had probably expected to die in the woods. She wasn't used to kindness from people outside her own tribe. Jack could see that in the way she held herself, proud and wary. "Thank you," she said, her words barely above a whisper. She tried to sit up, but the movement caused a sharp gasp of pain. Jack quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back to the bed. "You're not well enough to be moving around." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes searching his face. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back into the bed, though she didn't relax. Jack could sense that she was still very much on edge. Even though she was physically weak, she had a presence about her that was anything but passive. Jack sat back down in his chair, watching her carefully. The silence between them stretched thick and uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. "My name's Jack Carter," he said, breaking the quiet. I run this ranch. Her eyes flickered at the mention of his name, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Taya, she said finally, her voice still weak. Taya of the Apache. Taya. He had heard the name before, but only in passing. He knew the Apache were a proud people, fierce in their ways and their customs. They didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially ranchers like Jack, who lived off the land that was once theirs. I didn't mean to get involved with your people, Jack said, unsure of how to approach the subject. I only found you out there in the woods. I wasn't looking for trouble. Taya's eyes flickered with suspicion, but she didn't speak. Instead, she shifted slightly, her face hardening. She was thinking about something, perhaps calculating her next move. Jack could almost see the gears turning in her head. I'm not here to harm you, Jack added, his voice firm but gentle. I just want to make sure you're all right. Taya gave him a look, one that Jack couldn't quite read, and then finally spoke. I owe you my life, she said, her voice now steady but edged with a sense of pride. But I cannot stay here forever. Jack frowned, unsure of what she meant. What do you mean? I don't belong here, she said. I must go back to my people. Jack's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't been prepared for it. He didn't want her to leave. There was something about Taya, something he couldn't explain, that made him want to protect her. But he knew that wasn't possible. She was Apache, and her tribe would never accept him. Even if he wanted to help her, there was too much history between their people. He couldn't imagine the consequences of getting involved with her. You're free to leave whenever you want, Jack said, trying to sound casual. But you'll need more time to heal. You're not strong enough yet. Taya's gaze softened, though she didn't respond right away. Jack could tell she was torn between something deep inside her and the reality of her situation. It wasn't just about survival. It was about pride, about who she was and the people she had come from. I'll stay until I can walk, she said quietly. Then I'll leave. Jack didn't argue. He knew better than to try and convince her to stay longer. But a part of him, the part he couldn't ignore, was already dreading the day she would walk out of his life, for good. The days that followed Taya's awakening were quiet, but tense. Jack kept to his routine, working the ranch as best as he could with one hand always on the rifle, and his eyes often glancing back to the cabin. Taya stayed inside, only venturing out when Jack insisted that she stretch her legs. Her wound had healed enough that she no longer needed constant care, but her presence in Jack's house made him uncomfortable, in a way he couldn't explain. The ranch was no longer just his, there was someone else here now, and that was something Jack wasn't used to. The first few days after Taya woke were filled with silence. At first she spoke little, and when she did, her words were carefully chosen, always cautious, always calculating. Jack didn't mind the quiet, he was used to it. He never had much to say himself, but there was a weight to the silence now, one that didn't sit well with him. Jack had tried his best to give her space, not wanting to intrude on her independence, but the way she carried herself, the proud manner in which she held her head, made him wonder if she was simply waiting for the right moment to leave. One morning Jack woke to find Taya sitting outside the cabin, her back against the wall, staring out at the land stretching beyond the ranch. Her eyes were distant, like she was lost in thought. Jack paused at the door, watching her for a moment before walking up to her. You okay? He asked, his voice softer than he intended. Taya didn't turn to look at him immediately. She just nodded, her dark hair falling over her face as she gazed at the horizon. I've been thinking, she said, her voice low, almost as if she were talking to herself, about what comes next. Jack remained silent, unsure of how to respond. He had been thinking about that too. He had known from the start that Taya wouldn't stay forever, but something about the way she said it now made him wonder if she had already decided to leave. You're not ready yet, Jack said after a long pause, his hand resting on the doorframe. You need time to heal. Taya glanced at him then, her eyes sharp and clear. I know, but I can't stay here forever, Jack. That sense of finality in her voice. Jack didn't want her to leave, but he knew better than to argue. Do you have a place to go? Jack asked, his tone even but careful. Taya shook her head. I'm a long way from home. Was she talking about her tribe? Before Jack could ask, a low rumble of thunder echoed from the distance. Dark clouds had begun to gather in the sky, the first signs of a storm rolling in. The wind picked up, sending dust and debris across the land. Taya stood, brushing off the dirt from her clothes, her posture shifting slightly as if she had heard something Jack hadn't. They're coming, she whispered, her voice urgent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Who's coming? he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. His mind raced. Could it be the Apache tribe? Was it the warriors from before, the ones who had attacked Taya? Taya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped away from the cabin, her eyes scanning the distance. I don't know, she said quietly, almost to herself. But they'll find me. They always do. Jack felt a cold chill run through him. He had been preparing for this moment, knowing that one day Taya's past would catch up with her. But now that it was happening, he wasn't ready. He didn't know what to do. I can't stay here, Taya said, turning to look at him, her face determined. I won't put you in danger. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had always lived alone. He had never been one for complications, but this woman, this Apache warrior, had thrown his life into chaos. He hadn't expected to care about what happened to her, but now, with danger approaching, his feelings were clear. He wasn't going to let her leave. Not now. Not like this. You're not going anywhere, Jack said, his voice firm. Not while there's a storm coming. Taya's eyes met his, and for a brief moment there was something like understanding between them. The tension in her shoulders eased, though she still looked uncertain. I'll stay, she said, her voice soft but reluctant. For now. Jack nodded, relieved. For now we wait, and when the storm passes, we figure out what comes next. The storm hit shortly after that, the sky turning a dark gray as rain began to fall in sheets. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows and doors. Jack had lived through storms before, but this one felt different. He felt it in his bones, a sense of something closing in. Something inevitable. As the hours passed, Jack and Taya sat in silence inside the cabin, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. Jack kept his eyes on the door, the window, knowing that at any moment someone might come looking for Taya. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they wouldn't stop until they found her. Taya sat across from him, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken much since their brief conversation earlier, but Jack knew she was thinking. Her thoughts were always far away, as if she were constantly on alert, ready for something he couldn't see. Finally, after hours of sitting in the dim light, the storm began to subside. The wind died down, and the rain turned to a light drizzle. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the cabin felt heavier, as if it had been holding its breath all along. Jack stood up slowly, stretching his arms. I'll go check the land, he said, grabbing his rifle. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew he needed to make sure they were safe. Taya stood up as well, her movements slow but graceful. She seemed to be listening for something Jack couldn't hear. They're close, she said softly. Jack's heart tightened. He could feel it too now. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. As he stepped outside into the cold air, Jack looked out at the ranch, his eyes scanning the land in the fading light. The storm had passed, but the danger was far from over. Taya was right. They were close. The wind had finally died down, leaving the land eerily quiet after the storm. Jack stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for any sign of movement. He didn't know who was coming or when they would arrive, but he could feel it. He knew that Taya's past had caught up with her, and that now there was no turning back. Taya stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The way she held herself, so calm yet alert, made Jack realize just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman who had been wounded. She was a warrior, a survivor. And now she was tied to his ranch, whether he liked it or not. They'll come for me, Taya said, her voice low but firm. It's only a matter of time. What could he say? He had already made up his mind. No matter who came, no matter what danger lay ahead, he wasn't going to let Taya go without a fight. They'll be here soon, Jack said, turning to face her. We'll face them together. Taya looked at him, her eyes softening for just a moment. She didn't speak, but Jack could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had spent her life running, fighting to survive, but Jack knew she had never faced a choice like this before. She had never had someone stand beside her, someone who would risk everything for her. Are you sure about this? Taya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded. I'm sure. You don't have to face this alone. For a long time there was silence between them. Jack could feel the weight of her decision in the air. He had known all along that he would have to choose between his own safety and his loyalty to Taya. But standing there, in the fading light of the storm, he knew that this was no longer just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore. We can't stay here forever, Taya said, breaking the silence. If we stay, they'll find us. And they'll come after you. I know, Jack replied, his voice steady. But we'll figure it out. I will leave together if we have to. I won't let them take you. Taya didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the land stretching out before them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the field, and Jack could almost feel the tension building, as if the land itself was waiting for what would come next. The sound of hooves broke the silence. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were here. Taya's hand instinctively went to the knife at her side, but Jack placed a hand on her wrist, stopping her. No, not yet, he said quietly. We'll face them together, without bloodshed if we can help it. Taya didn't say anything, but Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She had been taught to fight, to never show weakness. But now, she was being asked to trust Jack, to stand by him even if it meant risking everything. The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon figures appeared on the horizon. They were riders, moving quickly through the dust. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. He wasn't sure who they were, but they weren't from the town. These men were different, wild, untamed. As they drew closer, Jack stepped forward, positioning himself between Taya and the riders. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their horses kicking up dust as they slowed to a stop. There were 3 of them, all dressed in rough clothing, their faces hidden under hoods. One of them dismounted and approached Jack with a cold, calculating look. You have something that belongs to us, the man said, his voice harsh. His eyes flickered to Taya, and for a moment Jack thought he saw recognition in them. But the man quickly turned his gaze back to Jack. She's not yours to keep, the man continued. She's Apache. You've been sheltering her. You've been hiding her from us. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the rifle still resting at his side. He wasn't afraid of these men, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough to convince them. She's under my protection, Jack said, his voice steady but firm. You won't be taking her. The man's eyes narrowed. You think you can stop us? He scoffed. You're just a rancher. You have no business getting involved in Apache matters.
Jack didn't back down.
She's a person, not a prize. She's not some trophy to be taken. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other, the tension between them thick. Then the man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't keep you alive. Before Jack could respond, Taya stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the man. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice calm but filled with authority. The man hesitated, his expression flickering with surprise. Jack didn't understand the words, but he could tell that Taya wasn't backing down. Whatever she said seemed to have an effect on the men, and they exchanged uneasy glances. After a long pause, the man finally nodded. We'll let you go, for now, he said, his voice low. But if you ever cross paths with us again, there will be consequences. Without another word, the riders mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Jack stood there for a long moment, his heart still racing. He had been prepared to fight, but he hadn't expected it to end like this. Taya didn't say anything at first. She simply watched as the riders faded into the distance. Then she turned to Jack, her face unreadable. You were right, she said quietly. We didn't have to fight. He felt a mix of relief and frustration. They had escaped this time, but he knew it wasn't over. There would always be more riders, more threats. They couldn't stay here forever. We'll leave tomorrow, Jack said, his voice firm. We'll find somewhere safe. Together. Taya nodded, her expression softening for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch. She didn't say anything, but Jack could see the trust in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. They had made it through this day, but there would be more days ahead, and Jack knew that whatever came next, they would face it together,